So what about the argument about low stakes? Yeah. So, well, there's nothing to prevent you giving higher stakes, right? Instead of say $50, if you perform well, you could give higher stakes, although you do have to get through ethical approval for that. But business studies do normally provide incentive rewards. Very interesting thing here was that Cameron in 1999 used the high purchasing power of the Australian dollar to provide incentives that were actually equal to 1 month's salary for an independent for an Indonesian study. So Cameron did the study in Indonesia, but because of the difference in the purchasing power of the Australian dollar, that a small amount of Australian dollars would actually turned out to be equal to 1 month's salary. And Cameron found that the size of the stake made little difference to the behavior, right? So raising the stakes didn't really make much difference, right? So the stakes that you would normally use in an experiment turn out to be just fine. So the other things that the editors are worried about is biases, right? So anchoring is one, right, where you tend to stay with the default option, right? And I think we talked about this with surveys as well. That means if you change the default, for example, how much are you willing to save? You set it at 5% of your salary. That was what the question was set at in the experiment. People might stay close at 5 or close to it. But if you changed it to 10, again, people might change at 10 or close to it, right? So there's a real issue about anchoring bias that you, so in other words, when you're setting up the experiment, you would set the default differently for each subject to make sure that the anchoring bias wasn't the thing driving the results. And the other thing that we've talked about, other bias that we've talked about quite a bit, is the order effects. The 3-hour sleep followed by the 10-hour sleep, or the 10-hour sleep followed by the 3-hour sleep. And again, you can mix that up, right? You can have one participant having 3 hours followed by 10, and the other participant having 10 hours sleep followed by 3 hours sleep. So you can mix up so that you get rid of these biases, the anchoring and order effects. Ethical approval is very important. Anytime you're doing research involving human subjects, you need to have ethical approval. And I think we talked about last time we talked about the prison experiment at Stanford University, where students were allocated either as guards or prisoners, and they started acting out and being sort of horrible to each other. The guards were cruel, and the prisoners were surly and secretive. The other one is after that, it was obvious that you really shouldn't just go and do these experiments because it can have a profound effect on the mental health of the participants. The other experiment that went wrong is the Milgram-Avenia study at Yale. So you were allocated to be a teacher, so you were the only participant. You were in a room asking the student questions, but the student was part of the experiment. So you were in a room, you asked the student questions. If the student got it wrong, you pushed a button, which gave an electric shock. And when you gave the electric shock, you weren't really giving electric shock, but you didn't know that. And the student, the person who was part of the experiment, as the student was in a different room, you couldn't see them, but they would start screaming, right, as if they'd got an electric shock. And eventually the students get more and more questions wrong until finally you have to push a button that says lethal, fatal shock. You push this button, it will give a fatal electric shock. And unbelievably, 2/3 of the participants, 2/3 of the teachers actually pushed the button. Some of them were hesitant, and they'd look up to the person who was in the room with them, helping conduct the experiment, and say, well, that's going to kill them. And the person in the room would say, look up from their notepad and say, but it is necessary for the experiment. And the people would go and do it. So there's, imagine how bad those people felt afterwards, right? it would have led to huge psychological damage. Right? So because of experiments like the Milgram experiment at Yale and the Zimbardo prison experiment at Stanford, we now have to have ethical approval before we're able to do any research at all involving human subjects. So the main thing here is that you do need to get ethical approval prior to conducting, and you've got to do it before, right? You've got to get the ethical approval prior to doing any research at all, right? Any experiment at all with human subjects. So examples, yeah. So you see these are very good journals. The Journal of Finance is an experiment by these very noted researchers. Peter Bositz is well known in the experimental field. The American Economic Review is another major, designing tool, how to run an auction so you eliminate price bubbles. Moral hazard in team production, that's in management science, and prescription and treatment in health markets. Yeah, so this is one of the people at our own university, Lila Zhang. Yeah? So they're examples of some research and using experiments that are published in top journals. And then where to from here? You'll find the paper by Nika Forkas, really, really good for the student, experimental economics. Yeah. Here in accounting, there's a review and classification of experimental economics, research and accounting. List, Sadoff and Wagner. So you want to run an experiment. Now what? Some simple rules of thumb. That's in experimental economics. Beltovich, what's to know about laboratory experimentation in economics?
Sorry, Tom, are you moving?
Like this,
are you moving slide, Tom?
Sorry. Course, national course on research methodologies.
Excuse me, Tom.
For those who want to do their analysis in R, the free software, McCulloch has a very good treatment of this business experiments with R. Yeah, business experiments with R. So very, very good.
Yeah.
Go back. Ethical approval. Okay, so we looked at the reason you have to get ethical approval is because of these famous studies that went wrong. The Milgram study at Yale, and the prison experiment at Stanford. Some examples of experiments that get published in the top journals, the major, paper here by Bosarts in the Journal of Finance. This guy here, Maras Savata, that's in the American Economic Review. That's a guy at our university that just got published. Solution for the moral hazard problem. That's in management science, and our own Lila Zhang, published in health economics. So you see that these are being published, doing experiments is now mainstream and it's getting published in the top journals. Some great resources. The first one is experimental economics for the student. Next one is in accounting, a review and classification of experimental research and accounting. Fantastic. Next one is if they want to run an experiment, now what? Some simple rules of thumb. What's to know about laboratory experimentation economics. And then finally, if you want to do your analysis in R, then McCulloch 2021 is an excellent guide to actually how to do all of your analysis using the free software platform R. And that comes to the end of the presentation.